Hello and welcome to DSR's Still Consciousness. I'm David Rothkopf, your host. This week we are joined by one of the most valued minds that we get to deal with here. Alondra Nelson holds the Harold F. Linder Chair and leads the Science, Technology, and Social Values Lab at the Institute for Advanced Study. How are you doing today, Alondra?
I'm doing great, David. How are you?
Good. I mean, considering the state of the world, I'm as good
Yes, there's
as good
always
as
that.
it.
That's that's the asterisk.
Yes. Well, we're slogging ahead, but with that in mind, let me posit a thought, and it's, I don't know. I mean, maybe it's just slightly contrarian, but let me suggest that while all the headlines, for pretty understandable reasons this week, are focused on the war with Iran and the unrest in the Middle East, that in the long term, we may conclude that the bigger story of the past week is that the Pentagon has come out of the closet and essentially said, first with regard to its dealings with Anthropic, and then with regard to its dealings with OpenAI, here's what we want. We don't want any of your darn guidelines, just like Pete Hegseth doesn't like, you know, crazy rules of engagement. He finds international law to be a real impediment to what he's doing. They and in particular, apparently they've been pushing on the idea that, if they want AI to do surveillance on the American people, even though that's illegal, they should be able to do that. And if they want AI to be involved in autonomous weapons platforms that decide for themselves who and what and when to kill, then that's up to them. They don't want any constraints. And to me, this seems like a really big issue in the evolution of AI, even if it's not, of course, fully resolved in any one week. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on this conflict. And frankly, as soon as I started reading about it, I thought, I want to talk to Alondra.
Well, I want to talk to you because you have such good thoughts about this as well. I think, you laid it out as being a contrarian, but these things are, of course, related because we know from reporting from this week, of course, that that Claude, whatever tool, system that Claude is being used in the theater of war right now in Iran. And so, these things are sort of deeply integrated. But let's just go back a bit. I mean, the whole thing is just curious. It's on the spectrum from curious to bonkers. And I think
It's where we all live. We live in that spectrum these days.
Welcome to 2026.
Yeah.
So first of all, it is the case that that it was the Biden administration that made this agreement with Anthropic, but it's also the case that the second Trump administration blessed it. So they had an opportunity to say, we don't want this contract. We're going to start from scratch with our AI contractors. But they took a look at it, said, this is amazing. I think that's in part because, that the technology is just really good. I mean, it's probably the case that the Anthropic Claude tool, Dario Amodei was on CBS a couple of days ago. And, he basically said that not only is the federal government using Claude, they're not getting the slower version. You remember, David, from working in government, you sometimes got the slower software because it had all the national security apparatus on it.
Yeah. When I joined the government, the State Department was still using Wang word processors. So
there we go. Right. So
right.
What we learned in this interview, the CBS interview, was that that Anthropic has been creating a new state-of-the-art model that's better than what's on the market for even enterprise for the federal government. And it's in a classified cloud, and it's strong and powerful, and it's got dedicated compute. So this is a great, powerful product. And so it's just, that's curious as well. So, and you think, why not just cancel the contract as opposed to, kind of throwing a fit, I mean, I think as Secretary Hegseth said, as you suggested, and also kind of trying to play the nuclear option, either, the Defense Production Act or designating Anthropic as it did, or Claude. I don't know if it's a Claude or Anthropic that gets designated as a supply chain risk. So I think, and this is my contrarian response to you, that the overplay of attempting to sort of dominate the conditions of Anthropic's work is actually a source, is actually a demonstrating that the government feels actually sort of somewhat weak vis-a-vis these powerful technology companies. So we're living in a moment in which it's no longer the case that all of the powerful technology comes out of DARPA or IARPA and then gets brought, gets said that it's secure enough to go to the commercial space and gets, becomes, our dashboards in our car, those sorts of things. All of the powerful technologies are coming out of private sector companies. And so this is a different world for the way that we thought about the national security relationship between kind of research and companies and the private sector and the government sector. And as much as it looked like, Secretary Hegseth sort of throwing the hammer down on Anthropic with the supply chain risk, I think what it actually revealed was actually how powerful these companies are. They have all the data, they have all the technology, and they might lose this contract, but it took a lot for the federal government to get there, in part because I think Anthropic at this moment probably has the best in class product. And, the fact that also it gave a 6-month on-ramp, off-ramp, let's see what all that looks like.
Well, no, I think that's obviously an important insight into this thing. But I think another part of this is Secretary Hegseth essentially saying, we want mil-spec AI to be whatever we want it to be, and we don't want artificial rules imposed upon us. And if we want to, let the genie out of the bottle, it's up to us to decide to do that, and not up to some AI company. And then, complicating this all somewhat was the fact that you have OpenAI, which once allegedly was, doing all this for good, for the good of the world, had Sam Altman coming in and sort of negotiating while the Anthropic thing was going on, and speaking kind of out of both sides of his mouth on this. So on the one hand, we want to do good and we have constraints, and on the other hand, what's the deal you want? DoD will take it. And that competition, along with the Defense Department impulse, does raise the specter of very powerful AI with less guardrails than some people think is wise to impose.
I think, yeah, that's right. I mean, that's where we're careening towards disaster here. I think that's right. But it's such an odd thing because let's just think back to like Microsoft Windows 95. If the federal government was going to have a national security air-gapped version of that, they wouldn't have said to Microsoft, that you buy it off the shelf, you download it, you ask for some national security kind of constraints around it. But the product is the product, and they signed a contract with Anthropic for the product. And moreover, they looked at the contract that the Biden administration signed and then signed it despite themselves. So, so it is this kind of weird AI exception. And I think this goes to a couple of things. One, that we've not had a kind of dual use sort of technology like AI that has the ability to be dynamically changed sort of constantly. So it could be the case when it's not air gap that there could be engineers from Anthropic who are updating the technology quite regularly. And it's also, and this goes to the point, don't tell us what to do. I think part of the don't tell us what to do with the technology is because they know that the companies distinctly understand how they work. And this is different from, even more, it gives the companies even more power than, I think Microsoft with an Office suite or, Accenture, et cetera. So I do think that the companies are, I think we're still in a situation where the companies are going to be distinctly powerful in this space. And as I understand the contract, so the Anthropic contract was supposed to be up to $200 million. as I understand it, only 2 million of that had been spent. So it wasn't like, as we're seeing valuations for Anthropic go through the roof, it wasn't the federal government or the Department of Defense that was driving those. We also know that OpenAI, Anthropic, and some other companies are giving $1, they're selling the technologies and tools to the federal agencies for $1. So, obviously this is a long play. And over, if we think about Dell computers, over 20 years, you're making, billions of dollars. But right now, it's not the money that's the thing. And so I think, to go back to Secretary Hegseth, I mean, his statement about, I think it was, woke AI. And so it wasn't just that we want control over the technology. It was also this whole elaborate narrative about the technology, being woke and not sort of being able to have any constraints at all and needing to sort of dominate the space and all of that. And that really flies in the face of, what we know the American public wants. I mean, I think since the last time we've spoken, David, the negative sentiment from the American public has gone up by like 10 points with regards to AI. And I think this recent sort of controversy that really has captured the attention of the public in ways a lot of AI news, I think, doesn't, is only going to increase that, that negative sentiment. I mean, it seems quite commonsensical to many of us to say we shouldn't have unmanned robot drones and mass surveillance in American society. And so, I think between the fact that the companies will always know more because the technologies are being developed there, and the growing, I think, bipartisan concern about AI technologies, that, I think that, Secretary Hegseth and the Department of Defense might be facing some headwinds ultimately about this decision.
Well, one only hopes, I mean, Hegseth's very big on the warrior ethos and very big on being anti-woke. And the notion that somehow he's suggesting that, I don't know, that it's woke to not want to have autonomous killer robots is, you know, that's kind of unnerving. And it also raises the question of what's happening behind the scenes, on black budgets from companies that are more inclined to play along. What's Palantir doing behind the scenes? Because we know that they don't share some of the scruples that Anthropic may have.
Yeah, I think that's really worrisome. The other, related to this is that, let's be clear, Anthropic saying, our red lines are mass surveillance of Americans and these, unmanned, unpersoned, robot drones without human in the loop. That's the low bar. So it begs the question, like, what's happening behind the scenes with other companies? Yes, but it also, my concern is a little bit that we have set these red lines, which are bright red lines, as the high bar when it's actually the low bar. There's lots of other ways that we should be trying to steer, constrain, and sort of place guardrails around AI for lots of other harms, from, CSAM to harms to young people, mental health harms, people not being able to get a fair shake for rights and opportunities. There's actually a lot of harms to go around. And so while I think it was important to identify these, we've got this two-sided, kind of Janus face thing, where on the one hand, what's going on behind the scenes, we've seen even OpenAI correcting a little bit on what they said that they were what their red lines were, and going back and saying, well, oh, no, that's not exactly what we meant, DoD. We want to have a little bit more clarity about what we mean on mass surveillance, for example. But of course, it sort of moves the bright object over here, as opposed to the sort of growing cacophony of public outrage about everything from data centers to mental health and suicide risks for people in the world.
Yeah, no, I want to get to that specific issue in 1 second, but just one last question on this particular track. And that is, part of this to me is complicated by the fact that, unlike Windows 95, AI is a tool that invents new tools. And so, you baseline it, you set certain parameters within it, and that impacts then how it can be applied out in a battle space, for example. And you know, a lot about how the future of civilization goes is going to be shaped by whether or not a platoon commander is going to be able to say, hey, you know, military chat buddy, how do I depopulate this village? Give me 5 options. You know, I mean, it takes you to, if the tool is unlimited in how it can answer that question, the potential for mayhem grows. And I'm not, I mean, I could do the same kind of questioning along the lines of surveillance, right? But it AI is the slipperiest technology slope we've ever been on because it contains the seeds of successors that we aren't imagining right now.
Yes, that's right. And we're seeing that. I mean, we're the sort of evolution of the technology, of course, is now moving into these AI agents, which we see that we are really struggling to control. And, I'm in a lot of conversations now with, people trying to think about what should be the guardrails or the standards for how we use agents, as we get, accounts from social media of, technology experts and executives who are having their emails disappear, their hard drives disappear from the use of the agents, right? So not only is it the sort of self-generative ability of the technologies, but there is still just, and I think, this is what, Dario Amodei has said in a few interviews, like we just can't fully control them. And so, because they've got this, autonomous ability. And so it's not just, and that's just imagining the good actors. That's not imagining the bad actors. So we want, you'd want to maybe assume that the military leader that you were talking about was sort of on our team, whatever that means in this very complicated time. That's not accounting for how these tools and technologies are being developed and used outside of the US on all of the open source Chinese models that are getting increasingly stronger. We hear there's going to be, I think, another DeepSeek model being released next week that, make this a larger issue as well. But again, it's like, is the government, even in the theater of war, going to be, the exemplar or the race to the bottom here? And it seems like we are unfortunately choosing the latter.
Yeah, and of course they're countervailing factors here. A lot of Americans I talk to still underestimate the degree to which China, in many areas, particularly of applied AI, is edging ahead of us, and in some areas is quite a bit ahead of us. And you think, well, China might be a malevolent actor, but the Chinese also have this issue of wanting the state to control everything, so they put certain constraints on how these tools can be used by individuals. I can only imagine what's going through the minds of AI scientists in Iran right now, and there are AI scientists in Iran who are
Indeed.
saying, how do we, what is the equivalent of having a nuclear weapon with AI that can protect us from being beat up by some big country on the outside, or gives us an ability to retaliate when they're blowing up all of our ICBM manufacturing capability? And that's the in many respects the worst kind of bad actor you're thinking of, right?
Yeah, but we're also seeing, AI being used there a little bit, if I understand how these Shahed missiles, work, that these drones. And we're also seeing a little bit of a replay of the Russia-Ukraine kind of asymmetrical warfare where, Ukraine, and I think in this case, Iran are, using these small drones to sort of try to attack sort of the larger, more expensive, I think, American and Israeli technologies. So AI small to the AI to the small and AI to the large, I think is totally transforming this war. And I don't know if we'll call it the first kind of full scale AI war or not. Maybe we'll call that Russia Ukraine, but it is certainly the case that it adds all sorts of unintended consequences. I mean, one looming question we know early on in the war, in the first day of the war, that a lot of children were killed at a school. I think nearly 100. Was that an AI tool, an AI drone kind of gone astray, or was that intentional, or was that quote unquote collateral damage? I think we don't know, and I think the those kinds of uh, those kinds of kind of mass death occurrences and war are always kind of devastating, but more challenging and devastating still if it's because an AI made a mistake. All right, I
Yeah,
think.
yeah, and it also it underscores another thing, which is, and we've talked about this before, in Washington and in the United States to some extent, because everybody's motivated by how do I capitalize my company and make the most money I can. There's a lot of talk about uh, sort of AI as a big concept, AGI, right? And in China particularly, they're doing a particularly good job focusing on applied AI. And frankly, to me, most AI is applied AI. And your example is a good one where you could take a relatively cheap drone, a Shahed drone or some other relatively, and if you put a little bit of AI secret sauce in that relatively cheap drone so it can avoid radar defenses, it can be a much more deadly weapon. And so while there's lots of conversations at the Rand Corporation going on saying, how do we avoid a singularity that destroys the whole planet? Meanwhile, hundreds or thousands of people are being killed by quite narrow applied AI. And I think we need to, be more sensitive to the risks associated with that, right?
No, I think that's right. And we saw from, Ukraine, I mean, some of the footage of the Ukrainian soldiers were them literally taking drones out of boxes and sort of just kind of slightly reconfiguring them in part with a little bit of HI to kind of send them into the battlefield. So it's not the biggest AI only, right? It's an interesting, I think, moment for national security and thinking about these issues for sure.
Well, let's shift to another thing you've mentioned, and I think it's super striking to me. I've been doing this for these podcasts and the events that we do for a couple of years now. And one of the things that's kind of amazing to me is that when I started doing this, the level of awareness of AI was much lower. But there was this kind of approach to AI that was, I don't know, akin to other technological developments, excitement about its possibilities and so forth. And in the course of 2 years, because of steps taken by a handful of people, I think, but there is this growing sense in the population, and frankly, particularly kind of millennial and Gen Z population, that AI is just bad. It's, I talk to people and it's not nuanced. It's not, well, there's good AI and there's bad AI. It's like AI will steal our jobs. AI will steal our IP. AI will steal our humanity. We can't let this happen. I will avoid it. If there's AI in my phone, I won't get an AI phone. And in some ways, it is the most remarkable fail in sort of public communications that I've ever seen from an industry. I mean, at least Donald Trump periodically talks about wonderful clean coal. He's wrong, but there are people defending that, right? But
Yeah.
it's you must be going out there and talking to groups of people, and they go, "Oh, you're a bad person because you're dealing with AI."
Yes, I mean, people are really, there was a kind of lag of awareness, and there was that kind of moment where ChatGPT was released and everyone was like, wow, what is this? And, we had some data that suggested that there was a lot of it. Everyone, had used, a lot of people in the world had used ChatGPT once. But then I think it was not clear what it was for. And then there was a lot of concerns, exactly as you say, about AP, about people's images. We had the strike with actors and screenwriters. And now in the public, there's just a lot of angst. And I think there's, you mentioned the younger folks. I mean, these are also people who are like using, some of them are using flip phones. They're using, analog rather than digital camera, like film cameras. Like there also is, I think, among young people, a kind of analog renaissance that's interesting. And that is a partly reaction to knowing that there are problems with, addiction and social media, that people spend too much time and that they want to sort of capture their time back. There's also, I think, with high school and college students, they've been told their whole lives. When you think about the emergence of Claude Code, learn to code, like go to coding camp, middle school, over the summers, high school, get a computer science degree, learn to be a programmer and a coder, and the kind of golden road of your career and your life will be laid ahead of you. And now we have very expert folks who work in software and code saying we can't get jobs. And so there's the general broader existential, to the extent that the industry was telling a story about itself. Part of the story was like, people are going to lose their jobs, we don't know what to do about it, get ready, or but the other story is that people aren't going to have jobs. Young people who've been doing all the right things aren't going to have jobs on the other side of that, in part because maybe the McKinsey analyst jobs, or the even looking at the state of American universities, like being getting a master's degree, or going to getting a PhD, are not going to be kind of viable options in the same way. So there's just a lot of I don't know if it's quite a moral panic, but there's a panic, and it's not gotten, usually the kind of adoption is like more people adopt, more people get used to it. There's a kind of normalization in society that often happens with technologies. And I think we're seeing a kind of reverse trend line here, where the panic is just really increasing and more things are being thrown into the cauldron of the panic, right? So there's ever more issues, and now we can bring to that the concerns about mass surveillance and warfare and the like. And so I think I think there's a lot that's wrong with big tech in the AI industry, and so I'm remiss to offer them advice, but they certainly could do themselves a world of good by being able to, I think, tell and support a story about what these technologies could do that was actually really demonstrating their own constraint and the good outcomes for people's lives, rather than the threats to people's livelihoods that are being that seem to be around the corner.
Well, another place where there's kind of an intersection between things we've talked about in the past and this um, relates to this, because a couple of years ago when I started to do this stuff and you were doing this stuff, um, you'd hear a lot of conversations from people saying, well, the tech community is uncomfortable with Washington. It doesn't even know how to talk to Washington. There aren't many people in Washington who understand it. And, there was a story from Public Citizen just a week ago. Here's the opening paragraph. More than 3,500 lobbyists, one quarter of those working at the federal level, reported lobbying on artificial intelligence issues at least once in 2025, according to a new report from Public Citizen. The report also found that over the last 3 years, the number of AI issue lobbyists on Capitol Hill has grown by nearly 170%, and the number of data center lobbyists has grown by an astonishing 500%. That's just the opening paragraph. And this, I've heard different estimates that 25%, 30%, 40% of the money being spent in DC is lobbying around AI and related tech issues. And I see you as kind of having called this one before others, because when this administration came in, I remember we had a conversation about how they didn't want regulation, and you said, no, they want a different kind of regulation. And you don't have, hundreds of lobbyists in Washington if you're not producing legislation and outcomes. They're spending millions and millions of dollars trying to create the AI ecosystem of tomorrow, to set the ground rules for the AI ecosystem of tomorrow. And frankly, at this point, it's kind of the big money game in Washington. And it
Absolutely.
wasn't a game 3 years ago. It's an amazing transformation.
Absolutely. Listen, I mean, we should take seriously the fact that the, economic data suggests that if not for the like three or four companies, that our economy would have been in a recession last year, right? So if not for that sort of AI boom and a few, the valuations on, the sort of top 5 to 7 American-based technology companies, the whole world's global economic picture would look entirely different, including in the United States. And so, as a friend of mine says, this is real money. I mean, we're talking about money that is the driver of the world economic system. And so that's why all those lobbyists are there. I mean, that the money that they're spending on lobbyists is, probably a rounding error based on some of the, if you think about what's happening with NVIDIA and the valuations for, OpenAI and Anthropic, in addition to their partners like, Meta and Microsoft. So, and so go these companies in some way, so go the world. And they are right there in DC trying to give shape to it. I mean, I think for me, the thing that's frustrating as the former policymaker and a policy advisor is that they are, using these funds to sort of play all sides against the middle. So they're often lobbying on both sides of things. And, in order to just be totally not effective, right? And so that the outcome is that we don't really have any laws because they're kind of distributing donations and distributing kind of policy advice that kind of broadly across the spectrum. And of course, we know that OpenAI and also Anthropic have recently, and Meta have all announced PACs, to sort of lobby in different places around AI. So it is quite a scrum. And it means that, for the American public, I mean, how do you even get, a leg in that conversation? And, I think that's why the data center conversation has become so important. I mean, it is, a really important part of that AI stack. So it's, and it's not for naught that, very early on in the Trump administration, Sam Altman, and others were at the White House talking about Stargate, this like major, sort of energy and compute facility, because that's a big driver. But it also is where it kind of hits people's lives and where it makes sense to them. But that's not going to be enough actually to combat this, saying that people, as President Trump now says, that the companies got to have to pay for their own power and pay to sort of modernize their own grids if they're going to, be in communities building data centers, is not going to be enough to sort of hold back all of this lobbying power. And it's really extraordinary. And I think, the challenge of this moment is that in every part of this AI ecosystem, so whether you're talking about energy, the hunger for energy and energy consumption, that's the same for semiconductor chips, lobbying, all of the things along the sort of ecosystem are all at scale, bigger than I think that our economy and our sort of policy ecosystem has ever dealt with. It's a quite incredible challenge.
Well, I think another thing about it, and it's part of this transformative couple of years, which probably dates back to the introduction of ChatGPT a couple and a half years ago, and all of a sudden people's growing awareness of this thing. But it's not just an issue for specialists. It's not just an issue for the federal government. We're doing a bunch of events over the course of the next year on state and local AI regulation, because state and local, in many ways, is where the action is. You mentioned data centers, and you've got Illinois with a trailblazing data center law, and you've got the president of the United States who understands very little about this, even though his uncle went to MIT, as he often tells us. But the president of the United States saying, well, if you build a data center, you're going to have to pay for the power, because they realize this is a huge issue. You've got a candidate running for Congress in New York in a very crowded congressional primary who's a computer science major, who went into the state legislature and started passing laws that had to do with AI at the state level. And he's gaining traction because average people are going, oh, this is a big deal for your city, for your town, for your county, for your state. And that's also, to me, just a fascinating phenomenon that suggests that this ecosystem, in our first conversation, we talked about the global north versus the global south, right? We were talking on this big scale, right? And those issues remain. And there's national issues and competing European, US, and Chinese models and so forth. But it's getting kind of micro, so that it's getting down
Yeah.
to towns and at school systems and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, the city of New York. So you were talking about Alex Boris, and that's the New York 12 district election. I mean, it's like actually incredible that the New York State, in part through his leadership in legislation, was able to pass kind of AI safety legislation that doesn't look too dissimilar from what they were able to pass in California. So two major states, you could imagine, I think legislators who are against AI regulation talking about the patchwork, but if you can get Illinois, California, and New York, for example, to really kind of be aligned on the fundamentals, then you're really beginning to build a national consensus around legislation. I think so. I think that's important to watch for exactly the reason you suggest. I'd also raise into this conversation, the fact that one of the things I worked on in the Biden administration was this AI Bill of Rights. Ron DeSantis introduced an AI Bill of Rights, and it's in the legislature, in the Florida State Legislature. Has a few elements that are exactly the same as the AI Bill of Rights that we introduced in the Biden administration. I think you don't think Joe Biden and Ron DeSantis as sort of that's kind of strange bedfellows in the policy space, but what the Florida AI Bill of Rights sort of proposes is that you shouldn't, that insurance decisions shouldn't be made by you just by algorithm, that we've got to do something about CSAM. We've got to do something about harms to young people. That, you shouldn't be discriminated against because of the use of algorithms in AI. And so, I think that there's becoming, a sort of a common sense baseline, across the states, or there are these legislative asks, these legislative ideas that are coming back again and again that are not necessarily the patchwork, but in fact beginning to really fill out a really full and I think consensus based idea about some fairly basic guardrails for AI.
Yeah, by the way, I don't want to, we talk about how AI is progressing so rapidly that you can barely keep up with it. I feel the same way about our conversations, and we start it, and then it's 40 minutes later, and we have to finish it. And that's why I keep coming back to you, because we never get finished. But I don't want to end that conversation without saying that one of the reasons that these Bill of Rights are emerging and building off of what you guys worked on, and you have California and other examples in the mix, is that there are other people out there, including some very prominent people, who seem to would prefer AI that did discriminate. So that would prefer to build an AI that reflected their worldview, but did so insidiously deep inside an algorithm that most people don't really know is there. And that's why all this vigilance is so important.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, we see that with, the Chinese actually have pretty stringent, I mean, pretty, and pretty robust AI governance. But part of that AI governance says that, the AI models have to be consistent with the ideology of the CCP. So, that's a problem. But we also see, the Mecha Hitler example on Grok AI. So there's challenges all around. I mean, listen, we know that automated system and AI are created by people. People make choices about what's in the data sets, and they're always going to have, on a technical sense, a kind of bias. But they don't, because they have a bias, we can say this tool is more likely to do that, or have this perspective. But that doesn't have to inherently mean that they're discriminatory, and they're, explicitly. And, we can make choices about that as communities.
Yeah, and we have to. I think the reality is that many of us people who are listening to this thing are saying, well, yeah, there are bad people out there who have biases, but we all have biases.
Of
And
course.
some of them are sort of culturally baked into our cakes. And we need people to be vigilant to make sure that we don't amplify those things times a million inside some kind of an algorithm. And that's one of the big challenges here. Well, Alondra,
Yeah, and I
as
think, yep, sir.
yeah, go on, go on.
No, and I think,
Last
if
word.
yeah, I think we're gonna, this is a new technology. It's still really early days. And it's, even though it's sort of feels like we've been living in this space for a long time, and we're going to make mistakes, but like, I think we want to, if you're going to turn the dial wrong and get the bias wrong in a model, you want it to be in ways that protect young people, and protect people who are sort of vulnerable in their mental health from suicidal tendencies. You want it to be the red lines around surveillance and automated warfare. I mean, like, these are, if we're going to get it wrong, let's get it wrong to the good. I think.
Yeah, no question about it. And uh, it's why conversations like this are important. It's why the work that you have been doing for a long time is important. And it's one of the reasons that we'll keep inviting you back, because I find it so valuable to talk to you. And I know that our audience, which is growing fairly dramatically, also finds it valuable to talk to you. So thank you, Alondra, once again, times a million, really useful. And be well, and we'll invite you back sometime soon. And thank you, everybody, for listening. Please join us every week here at Still Consciousness. Join us at our AI, energy, and climate podcast. Join us for all the DSR podcasts that we do each and every day. And increasingly, we find people are wanting to follow us by subscribing on YouTube. Go ahead, do that too. Anyway, many thanks. Bye-bye.